Content warning. The following episode contains adult language, sexual situations, single, double, and triple entendres, and implies that your great-great-grandmother was a kinky bitch. Listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast, where once again we are getting a little hot under the collar. I have dragged Jacq White out of sabbatical with promises of lashings of the English vice, and we have seized the opportunity to put together a dream team of sex historians. On my right, author of the Once and Future Sex, going medieval on women's roles in society, Dr. Eleanor, cranking it to the Romans, Janega. Eleanor is a guest lecturer at the London School of Economics and a host of the Gone Medieval and We're Not So Different podcasts. On my left, editor of Sexual and Gender Difference in the British Navy, 1690 to 1900, Dr. Seth, oh my poor arse, Jacq. Seth is an assistant professor at Hunter College, CUNY, and winner of the 2023 Judith R. Walkowitz Prize from the North American Conference on British Studies. I have gathered these three august members together today to talk about 18th and 19th century deviancy. Pearls will be clutched. Moors will be probed. Aunt Mavis will pretend to be scandalized while secretly fondly remembering her youth in Milan. But no bodices will be ripped because on this podcast, we respect clothes, damn it. How are you guys?
Oh yeah, I'm doing great. I am really ready to pop this monocle though that I wore especially for the occasion. So shout out. I've reinforced the glass. It'll be fine.
And my God, does it suit you?
I'm doing great. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you. I love gathering august members. We love an august member.
So true, girl.
Can I just sit here and sulk ever so slightly that I haven't been given a nickname, knowing full well that it's a highly dangerous territory to allow Luke that opportunity?
I mean, I think Jacq the English Vice White sounds pretty good.
That works. That works. Yeah. But hello, folks. It's nice to be back. Very quick word of thanks to everybody who sent messages of support regarding the health situations of my family member. Strokes are fucking awful, but actually having people who are fundamentally strangers to the family member who is affected, for them to receive messages of support from these folks who they don't even know means a huge amount. So thank you to everybody. And it's nice to be dropping in as a sort of intermediary on what is fundamentally meant to be my own show. But also a big thank you, of course, to the team for holding the fort in my absence.
Would your family member take it as a compliment or a miss if we dedicated this actual episode on sexual deviancy to them?
I wouldn't care to speculate, quite frankly.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, let's dig right in then. Let's jump into the deep end and stay there for the rest of the episode. So, Eleanor and Seth, we're going to start with something nice and simple, nice and low and slow, right over the plate, with a very simple two-word answer. I think you guys can handle. What does sexual deviancy actually mean in the 18th and 19th centuries?
Okay, straight in then. I guess that essentially sexual deviancy means whatever an involved authority decides it is at the time. Because I think that two things can be true. There can be the more usual way of people having sex, which is however, man, whatever. Help someone out. And then there is what happens when you have outside hegemonic structures that are looking at the sex in question. So I don't know, if we're before the court, that means one thing. If we're in our own bedrooms, that means something entirely different. So it kind of depends on who's asking, is the answer.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And an interesting thing about studying sexuality in this period is that there were formal authorities who had promulgated sometimes very complicated and specific rules about exactly what was allowed and what wasn't, what are the right types of sex and what are the wrong types. So you have the church, different churches telling people, you have legal systems and courts, you have the doctors and other medical professionals. And so there are rules. And of course, we have that as well. And deviance is a useful concept for us. I guess the people we'll be talking about didn't always use those exact terms, although certainly in the 19th century, I think a category like deviancy is relevant for us and is an actor's category as well. But yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it.
Can I come in with a question that's immediately going to derail everything? What's changed? And I mean that in a few senses. Partly, I mean, kind of particularly thinking about, Eleanor, your research with regards to the medieval world, kind of what's changed through the Renaissance into the Enlightenment that's then sort of feeding the attitudes that we see during the 18th and 19th century. But equally, how much of that continues to change? I'm thinking particularly about how the Victorians get involved over Nelson's final words, "Kiss me, Hardy." Oh no, it can't be "Kiss me, Hardy" because that sounds far too homosexual. We need to make it "Kismet, Hardy." That's much more in keeping with Nelson's character. So, how much of what we see in terms of what we think are attitudes during the 18th and 19th century, it's actually the fact that we have to be, well, we don't have to be, but we are predominantly kind of teleological. We're looking back through the Victorian period and we're left this kind of legacy of Victorian sort of uptightness about sexual mores, which conveniently ignores the fact that we see this explosion in population during the Victorian period because everybody is incredibly randy throughout history, and the Victorians are the ones who crack the idea that actually we can solve infant mortality. So I went off on a bit of a waffle, but I am very curious about what's changed. And equally, Seth, what do you see changing over the course of this period? Are there sort of certain sexual acts that become regarded as deviant, or perhaps sort of are initially regarded as deviant, but then are sort of accepted?
I guess to start us off, one way of thinking about sexuality and ideas of deviancy in the modern period is that across the modern period, what we are seeing is a more rigid legal structure that is building up in order to enforce ideas about deviancy. In the Middle Ages, bleh, eh, the church can get a little bit annoyed with you, but the church are annoyed about everything, aren't they? And what are they going to do about it? They're not going to do anything, right? There isn't a state structure or anything that is like looking, for example, to crack down on what is seen as deviant sexuality. You probably do need to keep it a little bit under wraps. Like, let's not be sucking and fucking in public necessarily. That's not the way that we're going to do things. But there aren't police who are going to arrest you for sexual deviance. Part of this is because, largely in the Middle Ages, as I will never tire of telling everyone, the major way of looking at what you would think of as sexual deviancy is sodomy. And because sodomy is a much larger category than we now acknowledge in the modern world, that means that pretty much everyone ends up being a sodomite, provided that you are not having procreative sex, you are engaging in sodomy. So if you're having, penis and vagina sex with your husband while you are on your period, you are a sodomite. Congratulations, so that counts, right? And so if we go around condemning every single sodomite, well, then what does that mean? That you're just as much of a sodomite if you give your husband a hand job as you are if your husband is getting with other men, right? It's the same sort of thing. But what ends up happening with the creation of a more rigid state structure in the modern period is we A, invent cops, right? And B, we invent sex cops, and not in like the nice George Michael way, so in the bad George Michael way. So there is the idea that there should be people who are roaming about initially trying to, for example, crack down on sodomy. This is a really big problem. I would characterize it as a problem. For example, in Renaissance Florence, a famously very straight time. But they invent sodomy cops. So basically, they have police that are basically just looking around, waiting for men who are cruising. And then this becomes more and more pronounced over the period, A, as you have larger state structures that can afford things like police sources, and B, when you hit, for example, the Reformation. Because once you have Christians becoming involved in what I tend to characterize as a spiritual arms race, then there becomes crackdowns on deviants of all sorts. So that's why we see, for example, the witch panics, which happened in the early modern period. That's why we see increasing suppression of extramarital sex. It's when we see the closure of state chartered brothels. We see all of these closing downs of a much more permissive sexual society in the Middle Ages. And two things have to be true for that. One, you have to have a religious interest that wants to do that very specifically, and you have to have a state structure that allows for it. And then what Victorians do, then when they're looking through the past, because they are mad horny and don't want anyone to know, is then they just say, oh, yeah, you know how we have sex cops? Everyone always had sex cops. And in fact, actually, maybe when they didn't have sex cops, it's because they weren't doing any of this. And we are uniquely perverted now. No one had ever invented sex before now. Right. So that becomes a sort of wishful thinking that is then projected onto the past.
Yeah, this has been, I think, a valuable argument that historians of sexuality have developed. It's something that the philosopher Michel Foucault talked about, the ways in which our understandings of sexuality in the past have been refracted through the Victorians, but then also the way that we misremember the Victorians, and so the ways that we reflect on the past and understand this are often really off base compared to the primary source record or what scholarly research shows, and we find that in a lot of different ways. A really cool thing about Eleanor's book is looking at how we misremember and tell these mythological stories about women in the past, and sexuality and reproduction is definitely a part of that. A couple of things I would highlight, thinking about the 18th and 19th centuries in particular. You in the British Isles, you see a real restriction and kind of calcification of what sodomy means. It's not as expansive as it had been earlier in the Middle Ages and through much of the early modern period. Certainly in the British Isles, the definition comes to be anal sex between men in particular. Those are almost all of the cases. There is a lot of change in the legal landscape. Policing intensifies a great deal. The 18th century is the first time that in the British Isles we see regular policing of sodomy cases of men who are accused. There are earlier instances as well. There's some famous scandals. There's the Earl of Castlehaven execution in the 17th century, for instance. But things really intensify over the 18th and especially the 19th century. The definition becomes restricted. There are other little legal changes that are significant. And you also see in reaction to that the growth of, I think what we can talk about is the first efforts at homosexual emancipation. There's some really interesting new research going on about this. Traditionally, homosexual rights movements, the first instantiations of that, people tend to date to the late 19th century, but historians, I and others, have been finding arguments much earlier, and medievalists have found earlier ones as well. Arguments for naturalization, for instance, that same-sex activity is something that's found in the natural world, or it's part of God's creation, and so it should be acceptable. With the Enlightenment, with the growth of liberalism as an ideology, it becomes possible to make liberal arguments for toleration, and so you find those. You find there was an effort, a publishing effort early in the 18th century, for instance, to justify same-sex activity. It was suppressed, so we need to think about censorship and other things like that. But people are putting these ideas forward, so that's a really interesting piece. And we actually see decriminalization in much of the European continent. Following the French Revolution and the spread of the Napoleonic Code. Britain's laws actually become harsher in many ways, and you have more people being persecuted. But it's a very interesting and complex movement. We also have the end of sodomy executions in the 1830s. There's essentially a judicial revolt in Britain. So even though the death penalty is not removed until 1861, attitudes change really quickly. It's really fascinating to see. We should pay attention as well to the kind of fate of the regulation of sex work, female sex workers in particular, but of course there are large communities of male sex workers too. the history of prostitution under the Victorians is really fascinating. The Contagious Diseases Acts, other things like that. A lot of intense fear around sexual disease in particular, and sexual disease being spread to soldiers, to sailors, to soldiers, and others. The Contagious Diseases Acts are very much focused on military communities in particular. Always an important place to look for this stuff. And another thing I'll note that's certainly worth paying attention to and thinking of in terms of the kind of trajectory of what had been sodomy in the Middle Ages and even earlier is cultural panic around masturbation and the medicalization of masturbation in the 18th century, and then these kind of wild looking. Well, in fact, maybe they're not that wild, actually, looking back at like the spermatorrhea panic of the 19th century. But in fact, I was just reading that there's a big TikTok anti-masturbation trend right now. So these ideas keep kicking around, and we find stuff. Some of this is, medieval medical panic or early modern worries about what'll happen if you masturbate too often or you have wet dreams, and how that can damage your body, destroy your reproductive capacity, make you insane, other things like that. So some of these are old ideas that are still kicking around, in fact.
I just want to point out, to drag everything back down, that sodomy police maps perfectly syllable wise onto KRS-One sounded to police uh, as a pitch perfect update to a classic East Coast hip hop.
Drop the
I
remix. Drop the remix.
Drop the remix.
KRS, please come back. We need you.
I wanted to ask a brief follow up on something Eleanor said, and it may have been a misspeak, but I think it's an interesting point. You said that sodomy in the medieval period is equally things like hand jobs versus sex with men. But the way you phrased it is that you're guilty of sodomy whether you're giving your husband a hand job or whether he's fucking other men. And I'm curious about the sort of the movement of crime, punishment, and especially stigma across marital bounds.
Yeah,
Right? Like if
that was a misspeak, but this is an interesting point. You are right. So keep going, King. Come on, let's go.
so basically, right, if I mean in the medieval period, but also in when we're talking about, you know, is this sort of the family is tarred with this brush, right? This is a classic trope of romance novels everywhere, right? One girl gets slightly kinky with a cavalry officer, and suddenly the whole family is unmarriageable. But at the same time, we have that sort of, well, men will be men after they've given their heirs. They're allowed to go to the brothels and fuck. So what's the actual truth here about the sort of the blood-brain barrier of marriage, as it were?
Well, the way to think about this is that, again, in the medieval period, things are more permissive. And that has to do with the fact that, in the medieval period, you don't have categories like we do now of sexual identity. It's just either you are doing sodomy or you aren't. It's about your action. It isn't about who you are. And so as a result, even if you are married to a man and he's off, with men on the side, well, he's just, doing some light sodomy, and it doesn't really have anything to do with you. So, for example, quite famously here, like probably Richard the Lionheart, right? Big fan of the dudes, and like he's probably bi in that he's fathered illegitimate children. So, I think he'll sort of take all comers. And I didn't mean to do that, but we're gonna pretend I did. Anyway, so and it basically just doesn't come up. It's very rare. And we will see particular examples. And obviously we know more about royalty, which is why I'm bringing royalty into it here. But for example, you see this with Edward II, who is notedly quite gay. And he has his boyfriends around the shop and elevates them to really high levels. But the issues that he ends up facing don't have to do with the fact that he's got boyfriends, they have to do with the fact that he's taking land off of other people and giving the boyfriends the stuff. And everyone's like, hey, that's my land. And that's the problem. It's more of the knock-on actions than the theoretical sodomy. And will they then bring it into it? Yes, they will. But they are completely willing to put up with it, provided you are offering a good service as a king. So within the medieval world, there's a bit more of your reputation and your other actions can shield you to an extent from worries about your theoretical sexual deviancy. And we see this shed, I think, in the modern period as we begin to ossify, as we begin to develop the idea that there are sexual identities, right? Because if you shag one guy, as the story goes, like, and then suddenly that's the thing about you. Whereas in the medieval period, everyone's, shagging around. Like you'll see, for example, medical manuals, the opposite of masturbation panics in the 19th century. But you will see medical manuals written about younger women and men, and they will say, oh, well, before young people get married, oftentimes their humors are building up. And so you know how it is. Young girls will jack each other off. Everyone knows this, how the girlies jack each other off, and well, it's fine from a medical standpoint, it's fine. And if it gets too head up, they're just gonna have to see the doctor to jack them off anyway. So that's fine. Whereas by the time you get to, of course, the 19th century, it's like you'll go blind, et cetera, and all of these things. This isn't to say that everyone is really up for onanism, as it's called in the medieval period. But it's interesting in that there's much more of an idea of masturbatory practices as a medical necessity, and oftentimes something that is kind of knocked onto other partners. So, very specifically, yay, we all love jacking off. So you then see this get lost in the early modern period, and suddenly there are different ways of looking at reputation. There's different ways of looking at individuals. And so, yes, in the medieval period, you have, for example, the fama, or the reputation, that can be damaged, but that can also and must needs be connected to the idea that these things can be overcome through, for example, confession. Catholicism doesn't work if people don't have the ability to repair themselves, whereas Protestantism don't care about that, right? Like Protestantism doesn't care if you said you're sorry. It's just like you can keep that hanging around. So again, when we invent new types of Christianity, we also invent the fact that you're not really able to shed these actions, and indeed that these actions are in and of themselves an identity.
That's really interesting. I like that, and I think it's good to pay attention to the family too, because these negative categories like sodomy are defined in relation to that. So the only traditionally, right, officially, the only licit sort of sex is penis and vagina sex, where you ejaculate inside your wife, and that's the only appropriate sex act, and also the highest sex act. And so anything that's sodomitical is outside of that kind of closed economy. And it is really interesting. I'm glad you raised this question, which is kind of an endlessly debated one. When do our notions of sexual identity develop? The idea that there's some kind of intrinsic, inborn, maybe natural thing called sexual identity, which determines who you're attracted to and who you want to have sex with and who you have romantic relationships with, et cetera, et cetera. And scholars have argued that this is something we see arrive in the 18th or 19th centuries. We have the emergence of a term like homosexuality in the late 19th century. We don't have language for that earlier, or not language that's exactly the same. But this fear about the possibility that any man in particular would have sex with basically anybody and would have sex with another man, if not for the safeguard of the family, shows the kind of complexity of that arising. And I think these are ideas we still see kicking around, certainly in a lot of right-wing panic around queer people, around trans people, these infection models of queerness, the idea that if you get one taste or you interact with the wrong person or have the wrong kind of sex, that'll change you forever. I think that shows that we have different ideas of sexuality kicking around, and some of these are very, very old, these pre-sexual identity ideas that again, men in particular are prone to any sort of type of sex, and that if they discover the great delights and pleasures of sex with another man, that it might change them forever. Yeah, I think we should pay attention to the family and this idea that it should be a closed sexual economy officially, right? You really only are allowed to do it with your wife in particular ways.
I am fascinated by this idea that it can be medically prescribed that one requires a hand job. And had that mentality continued, I think the National Health Service here in the UK would be a very, very different organization. But that joke aside, there is a really dark facet of all of this. And I am going to put a trigger warning in at this point, because I do want to look at one of the darkest facets of this in the form of sexual assault. Because as when I was doing the research for the doctorate and I was looking at crimes around sex, one of the books that I read was George Vigorello's A History of Rape, a really important study, but a deeply, deeply troubling one, which very effectively brings to the fore just how casualized sexual violence was. Now, this is something that has been very obviously a problem throughout history and continues to be a problem to this day. We are in an age where bodily autonomy is under attack. And the change that we are seeing sees kind of, I guess, the consequences of us having gone through a phase in history where, if nothing else, before the law, sexual violence is prohibited. But that's a result of a kind of a gradual process of treating sexual assault as sort of some kind of property crime, and then starting to think of it as an actual act of violence. So I guess what I want to kind of ask is what happens through all of this? You know, why do we see these changes in attitudes from, oh, this is terrible, this is going to affect the dowry of my daughter, to actually, this is a fucking horrendous act that we need to call out as a society? Because even when you look at the memoirs, I'm thinking about August Schellman, who's a commissary officer during the Peninsular War. He does not hide the fact that he was fundamentally a sexual predator. It's a boast more than it is anything else. And I'm not going to repeat the language, but some of the language is predatory in its nature. So how do we go from a point where that is happening, even sort of casually in military memoirs, to a point where society turns around and goes, no, that is not okay? Because my hope is that by understanding this transition, it might bring a fresh perspective on what could very easily become a resurgence of some of that casualization around sexual violence.
Well, one of the things that we definitely see over the modern period, I think, is the increasing willingness to perhaps admit that women are people, which is nice. This is not to say that women are not considered members of their community or things like this. But I do think that certainly in the Middle Ages, as you've kind of alluded to here, Jacq, we see rape not as a crime against a person, but as a crime against the men in control of the person, as it were. It will be taken more seriously if what we are seeing are examples of sexual assault of men on men. So that is taken incredibly seriously, for example. So that can in fact often result in death sentences. And we have to be incredibly careful when we're working with medieval sources, because the word raptus means all sorts of different things. And you have to read very, very carefully into cases to understand exactly what it means. But we do tend to see, for example, in cases where children are sexually assaulted, the assaulters will be killed. So they take that pretty seriously. Otherwise, it's a lot more, did you pay her dad some money? Did you pay her husband some money? And sometimes I don't think that is necessarily a bad way of looking at crime generally. And indeed, in the Middle Ages, we will often see that for things like murder, where you have to pay a hefty sum to the family in question. You have to undergo an elaborate penance. You have to promise to be better. Right. So this goes for a lot of crimes in the Middle Ages. But We see a real shutting down of women's rights in the early modern period, which, again, most historians kind of link to the invention of Protestants and this decision that, like, oh, yeah, probably I know who's making everything bad. It's probably women. And so that basically keeps things at the level of property damage for quite some time. And increasingly, I think post-Enlightenment, with a lot of women thinkers and the women philosophers getting involved, there's an increasing willingness to see women as humans and intellectual equals and people who can be harmed in and of themselves, as opposed to this being an insult to the men in question. Um, so I would say that I do think that it is slightly intellectualized, and of course, this also means that there is um, a differentiation in terms of who can be sexually assaulted. Because members of the aristocracy, posh young women, it's very easy for them to get sexually assaulted. Working class women, less so. That's taken a lot less seriously in general. There is a really excellent book which I have read and reviewed recently. Sarah Beechel's Father Chaucer and the Apologists, Cecily Champignon, and 700 Years of Rape Culture. And what she does in this, which is really excellent, is she looks at the theoretical rape case of Chaucer, which we now know wasn't a rape case, but she doesn't care about that. What she does is she looks historiographically at what was happening in terms of rape culture when varying historians were writing about this over time and various famous rape cases. And it's very interesting to see how varying societies dealt with ideas of who had been raped and how even ideas of the trials themselves will go back and forth. And so one of the things that we tend to see there is like there are outrages that get perpetrated, and it really depends on who the man in question is, whether we take it seriously. A lot more difficult to take these things seriously if the man is posh. It depends on what happens to the perpetrators. So, for example, there are cases where the perpetrators are caught in like terrible gang sexual assaults, but then sentenced to death, and then their executions are bodged. So then people start feeling sympathy for the victims, for the perpetrators instead of the victim. And so all of these things kind of ebb and flow. And I guess it really depends on how we're using personhood. And one of the reasons we're tending to see, I think, a return to these older ideas is that we are increasingly questioning the personhood of women at this particular moment in terms of the resurgence of fascism. And certainly we see that women are undergoing the same thing that queer people are, that trans people are, that everyone are. We're having a closing down of personhood currently, and women are always a big part of that, I think.
Yeah, that's great. I think those are all important things to pay attention to. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I started a project looking at sexual violence in the British military, and so I've been thinking and doing a lot of research around this. And I'll just throw in not just soldiers' diaries and things like that. Figures like Samuel Pepys are very clear that he commits sexual violence repeatedly. He admits to it in the diary, and he uses his position as a high-level naval administrator to assault women. It gives him access. So we need to think about people like that as well. And we have copious evidence, and people haven't necessarily interpreted it that way, but it's clear from things like Pepys's diary. Yeah, it is. It's very clear that there is a transition from primarily property-based understanding of rape to a partially consent-based understanding, and we see that in English law and in the case law. As we move from the Middle Ages to the early modern period, there is still a heavy influence of this property-based understanding of sexual violence. I just turned in the draft of a paper looking at the history of semen, and there's a very odd quirk in English rape and sodomy law where there's a tradition of judicial interpretation that the only thing that qualifies as a felony involves ejaculation inside of the body. So you need to actually not just unwilling, unwanted penetration, but also ejaculation. And the only way to explain that is a holdover of the idea of reproductive capacity as a form of property, right? And it's about purity, it's about reproductive capacity, it's about having children. That is applied even in sodomy law, which is very odd because you are not going to get a man pregnant by ejaculating inside of him. My understanding of the biology, at least. I'm a historian, not a medical doctor, but I think that's right. Um, and so we need to pay attention to these holdovers, and we certainly need to pay attention when we're thinking about how these laws are written and enforced today, because we see all sorts of old disturbing ideas kicking around. This is something else that you discuss in your book, Eleanor. I just finished your book, which I loved, so I have that in my head right now. I'm thinking about a lot of connections there. And we find this in all sorts of ways in our laws today, including in the ways that they're applied. A very, very small portion of people who experience unwanted sexual contact are ever going to be able to bring it to the courts. There's intense distrust of accusers, distrust of women, distrust of the young, which is very similar to what we see in the early modern case. So the idea that we've made great strides, we certainly have made some strides, and some things are different. In the early modern period, they didn't believe in the idea of marital rape, for instance. Those laws survived for a very long time. My students are always shocked when I tell them that's within living memory. And also, those laws haven't been overturned in some places. Of course, we still have sodomy laws that develop out of pre-modern sodomy statutes as well, of course. In some cases, those are still in the books in places like the U.S., which is a real problem when we don't get rid of these laws. Same for things like the Comstock Act, which are a real problem for us here today. So we need to pay attention to the ways that we haven't made progress as well, and the ways that we have a lot of baggage from bad old ideas and bad old practices. And people have done some really wonderful writing history around this. I'm a big fan of the work of Victoria Bates, who's a wonderful historian in the UK, who has written about the kind of long history of these ideas of things like, oh, it's a 12 or 13-year-old girl, she seduced an adult man or something like that. And she finds these instances where contemporary UK courts judges are saying things like this. It is shocking to read because it sounds like somebody in the 17th century talking about a rape accusation. So yeah, it's really good to pay attention to this stuff.
Yeah, I think one other point that I just want to say at this juncture too is that here in the UK, for example, one of the big issues that we are having at the moment is turns out that you can perpetuate sexual assault on people provided you're seeking asylum in the United Kingdom at the moment, and the victim is perceived to be white. And that's when, so, we're constantly creating an other that is the perpetuator of sexual assault, and that's usually racialized. And I certainly think that would very much be true in the 19th century as well. We see rather a lot of this, is that sexual assault is something that is always perpetuated by people who are not white, and then if they are doing that to white victims, then that is sexual assault. And why we create this, obviously, is because actually you become sexually assaulted by people that you know in your own home. And that's what happens, or, somewhere that but, you don't want to get the white boys in trouble, right? Like, white boys, no, wait, let's calm down, And so you have to create an other who is capable of being a sexual predator that then absolves the people who are actually committing sexual assault most often.
Yeah, that's a great point. If I could jump back in quickly on that, it's something, in fact, Jacq, you and I have thought about a little bit, and for the academic event that you're putting together later this year, probably, or maybe something that I wanted to talk about a bit. So the image of the sodomite in the 18th and 19th century is heavily racialized, heavily othered, and how do the English think of this? It's a Catholic, it's a Southern European, it's a Turk, it's an indigenous person. And so it's heavily racialized, it's classed as well, and then that shapes how policing and prosecution happens. And there are all these other knock-on effects as well. The idea that the indigenous people of North America or Africa or South Asia are sodomites, are rapists, is then used as a pretext for colonialism, for murder, for Christianization, for all of these other things. So the racialization aspect of it is very important.
reverse imperialism, right? It's the same thing as gay panic is the terror of another man treating you the way you treat women, and therefore this is sort of the terror of another country treating us as we treat them. Yeah, no, it makes a great deal of sense, especially when talking about these countries that are expanding at a hell of a rate imperialistically and, crossing border after border after border. I wanna follow up on this in a way, but also maybe move it at least partially out of the sexual assault realm. Um, and I'm curious, and this question does, as I said, does not just apply to sexual assault; it applies to everything we've been talking about. How do these punishments, when this is discovered, when it's prosecuted, etc., differ by gender?
One thing, like a shout out to the girlies, shout out to the lesbians. You don't get any trouble. Congratulations. Woo! The one good thing that goes on for queer girlies, is that as a result of, as Seth already mentioned, this idea of the acceptable form of sexuality being this married, penetrative, procreative penis and vagina sex, and that is the correct way to do sex, is that they're like, women have no penis, so there is no sex? Question mark. Eventually, like this is very funny because medieval people again are very much more like, oh no, those chicks are fucking, like they're really clear on it, and they will talk about it, and but often, so for example, if we look at penitentials, say from the 10th century, if you and your girlfriend are like just getting down on natural, that's kind of like a year of penance. If you get a strap on, that's 3 years of penance. And it's like the minute you have like made a dildo or made a strap on, and there's a lot of talking about that, then the dildo is worse than hands. A strap on is worse than a dildo. That's how it works. And it's all like penance. It's just penance, right? Like it's not anything else other than that. And indeed, we even see, for example, within Muslim society, they're like, aren't lesbians great? Like that's like a thing they write about a lot, where they're like, "Oh, these refined ladies have the wherewithal to understand that having sex with chicks is really cool." And you're like, "Okay, yeah, fine, fair enough." And we do tend to see, even in the 19th century and things like that, it just goes under the radar, because provided there can't be what they see as penetration and ejaculation, then you aren't participating in the same things. Now, does everyone want to say, let's organize a lesbian sleepover for our teenage daughters right now? No. But it is a lot easier to get around it. And definitely from a legalistic standpoint, you can't get in trouble for this, right? So if Oscar Wilde had been a gay lady, it would have been, things would have gone down differently. But Luke, you wanted to make a point.
I have a quick question actually, and it may derail you completely, but it's the kind of thing that I need to ask on this particular podcast. This hierarchy of sin, right? If we want to call it that, sort of scissoring at the bottom, then presumably hands, then dildos, and then strap-ons. Is this hierarchy of sin also seen and reflected in the price lists in brothels?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, I have very few price lists in brothels that survive to me, and we do tend to see that brothels in at least the early modern period and the medieval period, it does tend to be a lot more women who are advertising to men, or men who are advertising to men, and a lot less women advertised to women, presumably because you can get that for free at home. Ask any doctor. The girls are jacking each other off. I don't know. Like, I don't know. And so, yeah, I do think that there are, though, as things become increasingly involved, it is more likely that you might go see a professional about it,
That
is
makes
the thing.
sense. That
Yeah.
makes sense.
So,
Although, I mean, at the same time, and this may actually be a shocking revelation to some of our listeners, and I apologize if I'm about to shatter your sheltered lives. Women can, in fact, use hands, dildos, and strap-ons on men as well. Uh, so, you never know. We have temporarily lost Seth to internet problems. I got an email saying he's being silenced for telling the truth,
it's so true.
which is fantastic. But Zach, you have a question that was tailored specifically to Eleanor's research, and this would seem to be a really good time to ask it.
That's a beautiful segue that you set up there, Dr. Memory. Professional podcasting on a show like this. You're clearly going to leave to go to, I don't know, History Hit or something any day. But whilst we still have you in the room, yeah, you're right. I do want to talk about something that is very much sort of one of Eleanor's research specialities, given her work for History Hit with their documentaries. When it comes to sex work, is sex work itself the deviancy that folks sort of get pearl clutchy about, or are there certain sexual acts that sex workers are propositioned with that are like, no, that's not something that can be discussed? Do we have any kind of indications of this?
So I think it's a little bit of both is the answer. So in the first place, sex work is seen as deviant in and of itself in that it is commercial. And which is a ridiculous thing to say in a world like the medieval world where, it's not as though royals or nobles are engaging in sexual contact with each other out of any sense of romantic feeling. That is as transactional as anything else. If you were marrying the Countess of Navarre because you're attempting to get hold of it, then what is having sex with her other than a contract? But there is this commercial nature to it, and the difference between a medieval relationship to that and an early modern one is that medieval people think it's necessary. Medieval people believe that, again, if you don't have a acceptable marital outlet for sex, you're going to have sex of some description, because otherwise your humors will build up to a difficult point. And for men, they're worried that it will erupt in violence. For women, they're worried that your womb will collapse. Normal worries. So, there is this understanding that you have to have some form of a sexual outlet. And indeed, Thomas Aquinas refers to sex work as the cesspool that keeps the palace clean. The palace being the rest of society. And so there's this idea that you're kind of like sloughing off these things to a cast of workers who will kind of take care of it. And indeed, they don't see sex work as like great. They're not like, hell yeah, what a great career. I hope all the girlies become sex workers. But they also don't see it as kind of in the sort of Victorian, oh, this is, or indeed the way that we think about sex work now is like, oh, the only thing about you is your job and you're forever tainted by this. And it is kind of like a mark on you for the rest of your life. And, it's considered that most women who engage in sex work might do so for some time. And then you go repent of it. And then you go get married and you wander off and you do something else. Right. So, they do, however, face a certain stigma. And certainly we see more of this written about in the early modern period. There's a lot more stigma because they're saying, well, if you're receiving money for sexual services, then you're not in a position to say no when they ask for some real freak shit. So you go to the pros because it's like, that you've got a deluxe sexual thing that you want done, and they're not going to say no because you've got a bunch of money to throw at it. Right. And so that's going to be something that you don't do with your wife, but you do with a professional. And I think we see rather a lot of that in 19th century ideas about sex workers. When we've kind of created the conception of the angel in the house, nobody wants to fuck the angel in the house. Angel in the house isn't going to like spank you and make you bark like a dog. So you need to go to the pros. You need to go to the pros to go get that sorted out. And so then we have this worry about the kinkiness that's going on there too. And, the worry there is that people are simply enjoying themselves. And if we're talking about the correct form of sexuality, which is married penis and vagina sex, where you're trying to get knocked up, well, that's not very enjoyable, is it? Right? Like it's not something that you're engaging in for the purposes of pleasure. It's something that you're engaging in for the purposes of getting heirs. And so it's not particularly sexy. And they know that what is happening in brothels is?
This is a question that is, if you sort of looked at a list of every question I've ever asked on this podcast, which is probably over 100 at this point, because Zach keeps having me on, this might be the ultimate sort of me question. Are there any sartorial indications or shortcuts for deviancy or sex work? We've talked fan language and how it's almost a precursor to the hanky code before, but I'm thinking more explicitly, and I want to actually bring in a quote for this because this is what got me thinking about this. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article that talks a lot about William Makepeace Thackeray's Book of Snobs, and there's a little bit here. This is talking about a young ensign in some elite regiment. The closed doors of fish and lobster shops open after service, this is in the middle of the night, and vomit out little Ensign Famish, who is either tipsy and quarrelsome. When he wants to fight the cabman or drink and helpless, then some kind friend, in parentheses, in yellow satin, takes care of him. All the neighborhood, the cabmen, the police, the early potato men, and the friends in yellow satin know the young fellow, and he is called Little Bobby by some of the worst reprobates in Europe. Now, I've never encountered little yellow satin as a code term for sex work, but my God, that's how that reads to me. And so I wanted to, since I've got these two experts here, I want to know what your take on this is, and if there are other indications of this, beyond the famous quote from Blackadder, right, of putting a flower in your hat and making the old sign.
Well, this is something that in medieval Europe is legislated in varying places. So, in London and in many places in England, you have to wear a hood of ray, which is to say black and white striped cloth, so that everybody knows that you're on the game. In the Holy Roman Emperor, you have to wear bells. I like that little bell moment, you know. So that's kind of cute. You know, varying places have varying symbols for these things, and you know, it is one of those things where medieval people are like, yeah, you can do sex work, but everybody has to know you're a sex worker the whole time. That is absolutely necessary. But something that we definitely see from documents at the time is that a lot, not all sex workers, but a lot of sex workers are making a lot of money. So one of the big ways that you know that someone is a sex worker is their clothes is real nice. Right, like and so this is what with yellow satin. It's like so yellow satin is impractical, right? Like no one who's wearing yellow satin is going down to like go dig up the cabbages, right? Like that is a very particular form of clothing which shows that you are not involving yourself in traditional manual labors. And so it's a form of signaling. And we will see sumptuary laws come in time and time again where they're like, these girlies have got to stop dressing up because they are spending all of their money on lace. The hand wringing, for example, in Venice over courtesans and what they wear for centuries is very funny and incredibly telling. And the worry here is that people will mistake courtesans for noble women, but noble women are also consciously emulating the fashions of courtesans, and certainly we do tend to see that kind of across Europe. So, for example, I believe in the 18th century, there is rather a fashion for a particular kind of dress called a slammerkin, which is also slang for like sex worker, and they're kind of these very racy dresses, and the girlies at court are going ooh like that, showing some titty, and so there is kind of like a revolving feedback loop of this, and a lot of the time it just has to do with, looking kind of hot with it and wearing nice fabric. And yeah, just if standing out, I guess, at all is in many ways a way of kind of showing things.
Hi everybody, welcome back. Sorry, I dropped out there. We got too sexy. The government is I was recently censored in my research, and maybe it's happening again on this call. Certainly, dressing flashy for men becomes coded, at least potentially, as sexual deviancy or a way to signal that. I think this is very Luke Core, but I think I talked about this on the last time I was here. But there's this. I recently reviewed this John Gilbert McCurdy's new book, which is called Vicious and Immoral, and it's about sodomy scandal, Revolutionary era British Army sodomy scandal. A chaplain, and this guy was a macaroni, right? Macaroni, like from Yankee Doodle, macaroni, a flashy dresser, Italian style, right? You know what those Italians get up to. And so there's the sodomy scandal around him, but the major crime that people can identify is incorrect masculine presentation. He dresses too well. He has all these fancy clothes. He's riding by on his horse, but he's not in this really fancy outfit, and people are scandalized by it. And kind of flashy, like peacocking dressing definitely gets coded in that way. And I think that's particularly visible by the time we get to the Victorian era, and men's fashion, kind of mainstream men's fashion, becomes more staid. It's darker colors. We have kind of less color and ornamentation than we might expect of the Georgians. And then also the 18th by the 18th century, it's clear too that that there's a strong association between kind of effeminate dress and presentation for men and sodomy. There's the discovery, you know, in the early 18th century of the Mali subculture in London and elsewhere. And the allegations against them are that they do forms of what we would recognize as drag, that they dress and present as women, they use women's names. And so effeminate dressing can be a signal, a subcultural signal of same-sex interest, but then the wider culture becomes aware of that as well, and clearly that has some sort of influence on kind of mainline masculine dress and presentation as well. The fear that you'll be associated in that way, and so you need to have kind of a more staid, more masculinized presentation too.
I mean, these are all stereotypes that, to a certain extent, are still absolutely active. I saw an amazing post on social media a couple of months ago from a woman who was walking around Midtown Manhattan and was like, "Wait a second, why are all of these gorgeous men dressed well out? Do I have hope for dating?" And like, "Oh no, it's Pride. I forgot." And hope disappeared again. I have a very quick follow up actually, because it's something Eleanor said that just set off a synapse in my brain. The sumptuary law is making people in the Holy Roman Empire wear bells if they were in sex work. Is that the origin of the phrase "with bells on"?
I think a little bit, yeah. So it's kind of like, oh, like you're up for it, right? And also a little bit, you know, with rings on her fingers and bells on her toes, et cetera, et
Yes,
cetera. So
of
it's sort of like
course.
a bit of a, oh, isn't she Mary? Wink, wink, kind of
I
a
mean, I
thing.
know. Yeah, there is that legendary Terry Pratchett quote that the phrase "pull the other one, it's got bells on" stems from a particularly vicious ruler who liked to have Morris dancers tortured. Um, but I do like the idea that "pull the other one, it's got bells on" actually applies to the other woman who has bells on and therefore is open to being pulled in that context. That's fantastic. I'm gonna have to do some digging and thinking about this. Eleanor, we may have to sit down for a drink when I'm in London just to talk about that particular bit of etymology.
Oh no, I hate to go to the pub. That would be awful.
What I'm also loving about this is that in private conversations, I often refer to Murat as being like everything with bells on. And if you know anything about Marshall Murat's passionate lifestyle, it just adds an extra layer of insult slash aptness to the entire thing. But to bring it back to our focus, I'm kind of curious about the where of all of this because we've gone all over with this discussion in terms of talking about brothels. We haven't actually talked about molly houses, but some of this also happens in private homes, or there's a trope certainly around illicit liaisons in public parks. I remember a particular case coming to mind of a guy having the hell beaten out of him because he approaches a couple of soldiers in a park when they're on their way home from the pub, and they basically grab him and kick the hell out of him and then go and find a police officer. So I'm very curious about, the where of all of this. Where is this taking place? Because to me, this happens everywhere. But there are two sides to this. One is actually perhaps it doesn't, kind of thinking about what Eleanor's saying, that, some of these things are, some of these acts are acts that you would go to a professional for. But equally, there'll be preconceptions in society about where some of these acts take place. And I'm curious about how much of that sort of trickles through to the present. So that's a very sort of big esoteric question, but do we have any kind of indicators of all of these things?
So one big place that recreational sex takes place in the medieval world, and it certainly trips over into the early modern European world, is yes, in parks, in woods, in places like that, because there's no privacy at home. You know, you live in one room with everyone in your family. And the reason beds have curtains around them is partially to keep the heat in, but partially so that if you want to shag, you're not doing it directly in front of your children. It's not a very sexy place. So we have, for example, maps from 16th century, 15th century, 14th century Bristol. And there is an area just outside of town called Fucking Woods, the woods where you go for fucking, right? And just straight up, and everyone's in there having sex. And we have lots and lots of evidence talking about how people will just have sex in the field. They will have sex, like oftentimes in the woods, because you got a little bit more foliage to give you some privacy. And then this tips over when we get, especially to sort of like the 18th century, when we have the erection of pleasure gardens or people's gardens. Then people will like shag in the gardens, and it's like one of the things that you do. Like when you go over to the Vauxhall Gardens, yeah, there's going to be cool illuminations and neat hedges and things, but also you could maybe shag in there. And it just comes from a world where people don't have their own bedrooms, people don't have privacy, people are living in really close knit conditions. So outdoor sex is a lot more common because conversely, you are afforded more privacy. I mean, obviously, physical brothels also exist for those sorts of things, but say you are just kind of like an unmarried 1920 something couple and you want to shag, you're gonna have to go to the woods. It's not going to be within your possibility to hire a hotel room, and you don't have your own bedroom. So off to fucking woods you go.
Fucking woods. It sounds wonderful. I'd like to visit there. Yeah, the kind of the geography of cruising it seems in some ways to be very similar to what we'd recognize today. Like they didn't have like sniffies or anything like that, but people were meeting, and this is documented in a lot of places much earlier than the 18th and 19th centuries. But people cruising on city streets, bathrooms, toilets, places where people relieve themselves are important. Bath houses are really important. That's something you've written about, Eleanor, as places for sex, and also commercial sex as well. And we can trace the development, or at least some of the development, of kind of private or semi-private spaces as well. The Mali houses, I think, are one of the chief examples. So this Mali subculture develops a practice that looks very similar to kind of early gay bars, essentially. And they have some of the features, including things that look like drag to us. So meeting places, there'd be taverns, the back rooms of inns, people's houses sometimes. An interesting thing about the lack of privacy piece as well is that it actually the fact that that bed sharing was ubiquitous, for instance, actually creates a lot of opportunity for homoerotic contact as well, and normalized, and also very difficult to police. So if two people share a bed, I think it's easy for them to have different forms of sex without people discovering that. My research on the British Navy suggests that that people had sex, sailors had sex in hammocks with each other pretty frequently, and people expected that to be a place where you could get a little bit of privacy, and you could get away with a little sexual contact. People seem to have been really good at looking the other way, certainly for illicit sex, but it seems like illicit sex as well. And there were practices of kind of seeing but not seeing, turning a blind eye, maybe not really listening that closely to what the thumping from down the hall was, that sort of stuff. An interesting piece I think that we need to think about as well is the way that that policing and criminalization makes certain sites visible and then renders other sites totally invisible to us. So the people who tend to get policed for deviant sex are people at the bottom of the social scale. They have less access to privacy, and this is in fact a complaint that we find at the time. So in the debate around this kind of judicial revolt around sodomy executions, we actually find people like justices of the peace complaining, and they say, say this law is unfair because rich men can go and do whatever the hell they want in their houses. There's no way they're going to get in trouble, and these poor guys are going to get caught. And we also see this complaint and these practices repeated over and over. The partial decriminalization of sodomy following the Wolfenden Commission report in Britain has a really interesting, very disturbing outcome, which is policing actually increases, but who does it fall on? It falls on people who need to meet sex partners in bars and have sex in public or semi-public places. And then people, again, who can go back to their own private homes where the police are not going to look in. They can get away with whatever they want there, right? So this is something we see repeated in the late modern period as well.
All right. So, first of all, shout out to a couple. Eleanor's use of very apt erection there, and Seth commenting that it's the bottoms that get policed, are both top tier entendres for this podcast.
Top,
Second of all,
top.
top tier. Look, there's a top shortage. There always has been. So first of all, if you are interested in a Nap Wars pod field trip to the fucking woods, please drop a comment. We will be organizing that next summer as part of our 3-day conference. But
Can I just say we're gonna get into so much fucking trouble with this one?
I love this. It's like picnic and hanging rock, but field trip to fucking woods. It's
yeah,
excellent. Yeah.
we're gonna lose some Patreon subscribers over this, I'm pretty sure. But at least we can go down swinging. Okay. So this is a question that we actually had planned to ask. We promised to ask Eleanor the last time she was on, but we didn't get to. And I think Seth is actually going to have a really interesting take on this as well. Bastardom, right? We hinted at this. We talked about pregnancy and the social stigma there, but we never actually got to the bastardom part. So talk us through the stigmas and realities of bastardom from both the parental and the child side.
Well, again, this is classed. Obviously, it's going to have a lot more effect on someone if you are a member of the nobility and you're born out of wedlock. But having said that, that just means that you can't inherit your father's title. There, all the time, we will see Fitzhuberts and whatever the hell doing very nicely in the world. Thank you very much, right? So that isn't necessarily a problem in terms of being shunned from society altogether. It's just that, Richard the Lionheart had a bastard son and he became a nobleman, not the King of England, right? So that's how these things work out. In like, peasant society and places like that, no one cares. Just grow up, right? It's like, yeah, okay, there's oh wow, did you have a kid before you were married? And sure, there is some stigma. There is some like dropping the baby off at the nunnery. But we do have a tendency to see that if girls get in trouble, they will get married right quick to whoever knocked them up. That's the ordinary way of going about things because there simply just are more people aware of what it is you're up to. Village life is very close knit. Even urban life is incredibly close knit at the time. You can't like run off, right? If you're insurfed, you literally can't leave the area. So if you knock Sally up, that's your problem now, right? And everybody knows about it. So there's kind of like no getting out of it. Going to be a little bit more trouble if, a dashing Spanish sailor catches your eye down at the harbor, right? Like that's going to be more of an issue. But having said that, people just have much more blended families in general. Mortality rates are higher because, we don't have antibiotics. People die all the time in childbirth, for example. And so you'll have like a man with a whole clutch of children, from varying wives and that sort of a thing. So a blended family is not that difficult. Will it surprise you to learn that I'm about to say that this becomes more rigid in the early modern period? Because it does, right? So in the crackdown on sexual mores that we see in the early modern period, part of this is like a much stronger emphasis on the fact that you need to be having children within wedlock very specifically. We also see an attendant crackdown on things like abortifacients, and abortion more generally. So people are having those children, in the Middle Ages, it's kind of like the first 3 months is a get out of jail free card, like help yourself. No one really cares, because they don't want you to commit infanticide, which is kind of like the only other way we've got to do birth control at the time. So there's a crackdown on abortions, which means that more people are having children, which also means that there is now more scrutiny put on those who do not have a man in their life while they're doing it. This also coincides with our increasing, rigidity around policing structures and, things like marriage licenses. Marriage in the Middle Ages is a lot more wishy-washy, loosey-goosey. Like, did you go to the church? That, okay, then you're done. Like, no one has a marriage license. That's not a thing, right? So again, the more of a state structure we have, the more we have in terms of birth certificates and marriage licenses and all of these things, all of the ephemera that we have in terms of bureaucratic life. Then we see bastardom become more and more important because there needs to be a paper trail. When there aren't paper trails, these things are a lot more up in the air. So, the further we get into the modern period, the more this means, until now we've thankfully come to a place where it means a lot less, which is nice, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that kind of overall take on the developments. I think even in the early modern period, though, it is still the case that a lot of these laws, marriage laws and other things, are largely reserved for the kind of middling sort and above. Poor and working people still have less access to these formal mechanisms, and less interest in them as well. And also, they are incredibly restrictive. There's no way to get divorced apart from an act of parliament, for instance. And so they are constructed and run for in very particular classed ways. And people on the lower end of the social spectrum have less access and less interest in them as well. Having more flexibility is important in a variety of ways. It is very true. I definitely agree, and I find this in the early modern material as well. That if somebody gets pregnant, and we know there were practices of sex before marriage as a kind of normalized part of moving towards marriage as well. If somebody gets pregnant, that you do need to get married. This, in fact, we should tack this on to our discussion of sexual assault as well. One of the most common ways of quote unquote resolving a sexual assault case is actually to have the people marry. And rather than going to court, it's much more frequent than having a prosecution, in fact, and that's seen as a way to kind of resolve the matter. And I think we need to understand that in the context of small face-to-face communities, like Eleanor was talking about in the early modern period as well. There is also, the condition of bastardy affects you in a variety of different ways. It has important religious meanings, of course. That's kind of one of the main ways that people understand it and that the definition functions. So that definitely matters, and there will be differences there depending on your kind of confessional allegiance, what particular form of Christianity or other faith that you follow. There's some really interesting medical stuff around it as well. I'm glad that you raised abortion. I'm going to plug my mentor just published a book. Mary Fussell published a wonderful book on the history of abortion. Everybody should go and buy it. Please get it. It's wonderful. And she has some really interesting findings there, including that kind of older, looser ways of understanding and constructing family, even in kind of basic medical terms, persist even past when many people think they do. So the idea of maternal impression, for instance, the notion that what the mother perceives will affect the fetus. And so if you look at a picture at the moment of conception, your baby might end up looking that way. This is also a way to explain teratology and supposed monstrosity. These claims that women gave birth to a baby that was like a lobster or a clutch of rabbits or something like that. That these ideas continue even after kind of official medicine and other kind of authorities discard them, and that these are ways to explain why a baby doesn't look like its father, for instance. And then you can kind of make the family fit together, and you can explain it. And they certainly do have these blended families because we don't go through, in the English-speaking world, we don't go through the demographic transition until the 18th and 19th centuries, right? So we still have these patterns of frequent remarriage, blended families, households that have people from a lot of different walks of life. Some are related by blood, some are more distant, some are people that are hired on or are working there or apprentices or something like that. So these complex family structures, and there are ways to accommodate that and also to explain what a very strict kind of genetic understanding of relation from our perspective, would say, well, this person isn't related, or this person is a bastard, or something like that. So there's ambiguity and flexibility and kind of basic ideology and basic ideas about the body, even that let them get around some of these things where the formal prohibitions might seem like a real problem for people from our perspective.
I get the feeling that the four of us could just sit and talk for hours and we'd get into everything from sartorial kink on my side, do collar pins actually count as a form of collaring, all the way through to, sort of making your own cat o' nine tails over on Zach's side and everything in the middle. And I think in this case, as I've said before on this podcast, the only way that you two don't come back on here is if you suddenly decide to block our emails, because we will be asking you to come back. But I think that's about all for one session that our listeners can handle, or the four listeners that we have left. So, Eleanor, Janega, Seth, Jacq, thank you so much for coming on. This has been an absolute hoot.
Thank you so much for having us. Always delighted to come and make terrible sex puns. Thank you very, very much, gents.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a delight. I clearly need to up my sex pun game here. I feel like I'm falling behind, but I will do better next time, I promise. And yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Always. Zach, thank you for joining us. Our love and support and thoughts to your family. And until next time, this has been the Napoleonic Wars podcast. We will be back very soon.
Did you enjoy this episode? Be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back to us. And if you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. Don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording, in late August 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Nerf Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findley, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Zach Johnson, Simon Weathers, John C., and Rosa. The Admirals: Ian Harding, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, and Rob Painter. The Chiefs of Staff: David Maxwell and Adam Coslin. The Marshals: Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, and Brian Sillicott. The Legion of Scholars: Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Dan Hazelwood, and Bob Burnham. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Louis, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.